Against the backdrop of a fierce snowstorm, the mountain road slowly disappears into a white mist, and then, before the friends, their destination appears, an old country house, covered in snow, isolated from civilization. Chandler is at the wheel, his attentive gaze following the road, although the snow around him begins to drift more and more. "Can you see well?" Rose asks, sitting beside him, already slightly nervous about the darkness and the snowfall. "Yeah, don't worry, we'll be there soon, everything will be fine," Chandler tries to reassure her, though he feels an inexplicable sense of unease. The back doors of the car open, and Stan and Greg shake the snow off their boots before sitting down. "This is definitely not the best idea, driving in this weather," Greg says, slightly dissatisfied but still not overly concerned. "You're just scared there won't be any Wi-Fi," Stan laughs. When the car finally stops in front of the house, Chandler turns off the engine, and everyone gets out. They step into the cold air, and everything seems perfect, if not for one thing: this place is isolated, too quiet. All that can be heard is the whistle of the wind and the crunch of snow beneath their feet. The friends got out of the car and looked at the old house, hidden among the trees, which looked abandoned but, at the same time, cozy in its secluded spot. The snow beneath their feet crunched, and the dark sky covered the earth with a heavy blanket. The air was cold and fresh, and although everything seemed calm, something about this place made them feel a slight unease. "This is going to be a great getaway," Chandler said, trying to lighten the mood as they entered the house. Greg headed to the hallway, unpacking the suitcases. Rose peered through the window into the darkness, trying to make out anything more than just snow. Her gaze lingered on the black silhouettes of the trees stretching up to the sky, as if trying to hide the house from the world. "I don't know. There's something strange about this place," she whispered, staring into the dark. "You're just nervous because of the snow," Greg replied, pulling off his gloves. "There's nothing scary here." But despite trying to calm themselves, the evening became stranger than they expected. While the friends were arranging their things and trying to relax in the comfortable but cold interior of the house, they occasionally felt the sensation of being watched. Each one of them instinctively felt that something was wrong, though no one dared to voice it aloud. The first sign of unease came when Stan approached the window to check the snow level. He froze in place, staring into the darkness beyond the house. Where there should have been complete silence, he noticed something unclear, a swift shadow that disappeared among the trees. He squinted and turned his gaze to the others, trying not to look too scared. "Probably just forest shadows," he said aloud, trying to reassure himself, though his voice carried an uncertain tone. Rose, standing nearby, couldn't tear her gaze away from the window. She had noticed the shadow too but wasn't sure if it was really something or just her imagination. "You guys are all so jumpy," she laughed, trying to dispel the tension. "Maybe it's just a fox or other animals." "Not all of us enjoy scary stories," Greg smirked, trying to keep the atmosphere light. "But if there's another shadow, I'll start believing there's someone here." They all smiled, but something in their looks became less certain. Chandler, not wanting to show fear, opened the door to step outside, slowly making his way to the end of the garden, where the snow was undisturbed. He glanced around, as if searching for an explanation for the strange shadow they had all seen a few minutes ago. For a moment, it seemed calm until another shadow appeared at the doorstep. But this time, it was closer. And although Chandler couldn't see clearly, it was something human. He couldn't explain it, but it looked like a shape moving from the other side of the garden. He quickly turned back to the house, pulled up his collar, and returned inside, pretending everything was fine. "What's out there?" Rose asked, not taking her eyes off the window. "Nothing," he replied, though he felt something was wrong. But not wanting to panic anyone, he just nodded. "Maybe it's just the reflection of a tree." But the shadows continued to appear again and again. With each new appearance, their sense of discomfort grew. They all tried to find a logical explanation, but this strange, almost indistinct movement against the forest backdrop was becoming too real. Something was watching them from the darkness. Trying to distract themselves from their anxiety, the friends decided to have a few drinks and sit by the fireplace. But even when the fire grew strong, they still couldn't shake the overwhelming feeling that they were being watched. And no matter how many times they looked out the window, they couldn't help but notice, something was moving in the darkness that shouldn't have been there. After a while, they began to get used to the tension. The shadows continued to appear, but it seemed like nothing serious was happening. Everyone tried to stay calm, although their gazes instinctively turned to the windows every time something unfamiliar moved outside. The next day, as the sun was just beginning to rise, the friends decided to take a walk in the forest. They didn't want to stay in the house and wanted to leave behind the strange feeling of vague danger. "Maybe it's just a solitary forest animal," Greg asked, trying to reassure Rose, who once again asked if they really wanted to go for a walk after all the strange shadows. But Greg's response wasn't confident, as he himself felt that something was wrong. During their walk, they heard sounds they couldn't explain. Leaves rustling underfoot, as if someone was following them, and each time they turned around, they found no one. Each of them felt as if something in the forest was watching them. When they returned to the house, Sonia, one of the friends, stopped at the threshold, seeing an unexplained set of footprints in the snow, looking like human feet. They had been made recently, but they weren't animal tracks. Wanting to avoid panicking, Sonia tried to explain that they were probably local animals not used to such visitors. However, by the next evening, their calm was shattered by a knock at the door. No one was expecting visitors, and everyone held their breath. Chandler approached the door, and even through the thick walls of the house, he could feel his heart pounding faster. He looked through the peephole. No one was standing on the doorstep, but the tracks in the snow by the door led into the depths of the forest. Someone was here. And they walked into the forest, he said with a trembling voice. Rose tried to calm everyone again, but the mysterious visit only heightened their sense of danger. The next night, when everyone finally decided to go to bed, they heard noise from the attic. It started as a light rustling, quickly turning into something heavier, as if someone was moving among the old things. The shadows that appeared each time became clearer. Low sounds echoed through the rooms, and each of them felt a cold shiver down their spine. "This can't just be our imagination," whispered Rose as they all gathered in the living room, trying to understand what was happening. They all decided to check the attic, though none of them were prepared for what they would find. Chandler opened the door, and when they all climbed up together, they saw something they hadn't expected: an old, blood-stained knife on the floor, next to a few scattered unfamiliar personal items that didn't belong to them. "This is someone's," Sonia said, her voice trembling with fear. "This can't be." And at that moment, they heard heavy footsteps behind them. They all turned around and saw a figure in dark clothing standing in the doorway. They couldn't make out its face, but the figure was definitely human, tall, and ominous. Panic overtook them, and they rushed down the stairs. Each of them felt how every sound in the darkness was chasing them. But when they ran out of the house, something stopped them. They saw the shadow moving between the trees, clearly following them. "We need to run, this is no game," Greg shouted, and they began running toward the car they had left in the parking lot. The shadows continued to follow them, getting closer with every step. They knew there was no escape in the forest, but this presence, this someone, following them was real. And they could no longer shake the feeling that they were no longer in control of this place. Running through the snow, they finally reached the car. But when they turned around, they saw only the forest, dark and silent, swallowing their screams. They ran without stopping, even when their breath became heavy and their chest burned from the exertion. The forest seemed endless, and every heartbeat heightened the feeling that someone was nearby. The car seemed like the only salvation. When they finally reached the vehicle and quickly started the engine, peace did not come. No, they knew they were being followed. As they drove out of the forest, speed didn't help. The shadows that had been chasing them suddenly disappeared. The road ahead was dark and empty, and even the sounds in the forest seemed to have quieted. Everything was too silent. Rose was the most anxious. This couldn't just be a regular chase. It seemed like it wasn't just a person or a group. It was a nightmare come to life. For the first time, she began to doubt whether they were really safe. After several hours of driving, they finally reached the nearest town and stopped at a hotel. Only then, when they all got out of the car, did they feel that holding hands was the last form of support. Each one tried to regain composure, but something inside them whispered that peace would not come. The next morning, as the sun just began to rise, they still couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Everyone tried to pretend nothing had happened, but the faint reflection on the glass they saw during breakfast made each of their hearts catch in their throats once again. The same silhouette. Only now it was outside the window. Greg was the first to notice and, turning pale, quietly said, "We're not alone." They sat and stared at the reflection, and it felt like the whole world had stopped. It wasn't just an ominous trace or a random occurrence. This was their reality now. And even though they were in safety, a successful escape from the forest and whatever had been chasing them, they knew the nightmare wasn't over. This wasn't the end. For even in safety, they still saw dark figures staring at them from the other side. Under the misty morning light, their desperate attempt to escape had brought them no peace. The shadows reappeared, and they could no longer hide. But perhaps that was the scariest moment, to know that even in the brightest time, when it seemed they could finally understand that the danger was behind them, they could no longer confidently say they had made it out of the forest alive. And now, every time they looked at the reflection in the window, they knew it wasn't just a terrifying dream, but a reality that was haunting them. Everything that had happened had left a mark on their souls forever. The friends arrived at Bob's house late in the evening. The sky had started to darken, and the clouds slowly covered the moon, leaving only a faint light from the stars. They had left the city earlier in the day, and the drive had been long but interesting. They first passed through busy streets, then through empty highways leading to remote villages. Everyone was driving with anticipation, eager to take a break from the routine, relax, and spend a few days in nature. The friends were well acquainted, bound not only by friendship but also by a shared passion for trips like these. "This house should be perfect for a getaway," Bob said as the car stopped at the old gate leading to the garden. He was happy to have found such a place, even though, at first glance, the house seemed old and neglected. It was built on the edge of the forest, and its large garden, filled with tangled bushes and vines, added to the mysterious atmosphere. "It looks like no one's lived here in a while," Sandy remarked, carefully inspecting the house's facade. Old curtains were stuck between the window frames, and there was dust visible under the door. She felt a bit uncertain but quickly dismissed these thoughts. After all, it was just a house, and they wouldn't have to stay there long. "It'll be fine," James cheerfully said, adjusting his headphones and adding a light tone to the atmosphere. He wasn't one to worry, and his optimism always lifted his friend's spirits. They got out of the car, unpacked their things, and entered the house. The living room was spacious but looked somewhat gloomy due to the soft light coming through the broken windows. They all laughed when one of the friends, Brad, joked that the place reminded him of old horror films. But his words entertained them more than anything else. "It's actually pretty cozy in here," Sandy said, surveying the room. "We can settle in and start dinner," everyone agreed, and while the girls prepared dinner in the kitchen, the guys went outside to chat and enjoy the fresh air. At that point, they hadn't yet noticed the little details around them. After they sat down to eat, the atmosphere began to feel heavier. Sometimes, faint sounds could be heard, like someone quietly wrestling around in the rooms below. At first, Bob didn't pay much attention, thinking it was either the old pipes or rustling trees outside. But soon, during dinner, the sounds became more distinct. "Did you hear that?" James asked, looking nervously at the door that led to the dark corridor. "It's just the old furniture," Sandy replied, trying to keep the conversation light. She even joked that the house might have some ghosts. Everyone laughed, and even Brad agreed, saying it was probably just an old, neglected house, and these sounds could be explained by creaky pipes. But as the hours passed, the strange sounds grew more noticeable. First, there was a noise from the far end of the house. Then, when one of the friends went upstairs, it sounded like someone's shadow or footsteps echoed. It still seemed natural, like footsteps echoing on the old wooden floor. However, what happened a few hours later couldn't be so easily explained. While they were sitting in the living room, watching old movies and chatting, suddenly one of them heard a rustling behind the door. It sounded like someone had stepped on the floor of the stairs, even though no one was inside. "Did you hear that?" Bob asked, looking at the dark corridor. "It's probably just the wind," Brad replied, though his voice was less certain. He even stood up to check, but when he opened the door, the hallway was empty. "Maybe it's just the old beams or ceilings creaking?" James asked, looking at his friends. "It's an old house." But while most of the friends tried to dismiss any doubts, something still began to change the atmosphere in the room. It wasn't just rustling anymore. They started to feel the air becoming denser, as if the rooms were becoming unnervingly quiet, even though nothing seemed to indicate why. With each passing hour, their sense of anxiety grew stronger. Questions began to arise that no one could answer. Why were the strange sounds only heard at night? Why did it now seem like there was more to the house than just old beams and pipes? "Let's make this the last thing we talk about," Bob said, trying to take on a leadership role. He didn't like to panic, so he decided to put a stop to any more conversations about ghosts or spirits. But even he couldn't explain the strange events. For the night, they decided to sleep in one large room, where they hadn't heard any disturbing noises so far. However, once they had settled in and darkness enveloped the house, someone once again heard something moving in the hallway. It wasn't just rustling, it sounded like slow, heavy movement, like someone was walking on the old wooden floor. But when they got up and checked the corridor, there was no one there. "This isn't funny anymore," James said as they returned to the room. Everyone felt the tension in the air rise. Now, everyone moved more cautiously, as if afraid of stumbling upon something they couldn't see. And in the darkness, their journey was reaching its climax. What had started as small inconveniences was becoming something much more than just a night's stay. They didn't know how much longer they'd have to endure the feeling of fear. The morning after the terrifying night, when the sun had just begun to light up the horizon, everyone gathered in the room once again. The atmosphere was not just gloomy, but heavy, almost unbearable. They tried to pretend that everything was fine, but everyone felt that something was wrong. Bob, who was usually the main optimist in the group, was now silent and uncertain. He went to the kitchen to prepare a breakfast, but even there, something seemed off. The dishes moved from their places repeatedly for no apparent reason. At first, Bob didn't pay attention to it until he heard another sound, heavy, dull. He dismissed it as another coincidence, but his anxiety began to grow. Noticing his nervous expression, Sandy approached him. "Are you okay?" she asked quietly, almost as if afraid that even her voice might disturb the silence. "No," Bob replied, looking up. "Something's wrong here. I don't know what's happening, but this is no longer just sounds." With each passing hour, the situation became more bizarre. The friends began seeing movements in the dark corners, and even when they tried to ignore it, fear still started to fill their hearts. In the evening, when they sat down at the table again, cold spots began appearing on the walls, as if someone had splashed them with water. The fire in the fireplace started to crackle and cast strange reflections, as if something were present in the room. Everyone fell silent and exchanged nervous glances. "Did you see that?" Brad asked, pointing at one of the spots that had suddenly appeared on the wall. It was dark, almost black in color, and seemed to grow before their eyes. "Maybe it's just mold," James tried to joke, but his voice trembled, betraying him. "I don't believe this is just mold," Bob replied, now feeling very uncomfortable. "Something's going on here, and we need to figure out what." The night that followed was even worse. Fear filled every room, and each of the friends felt as if they were being watched. They all gathered in one room again, trying to keep at least some illusion of safety. But even here, in the company of friends, they could no longer ignore that something was wrong. Bob, desperately trying to find a logical explanation, decided to check the basement. It was the darkest part of the house they hadn't dared to explore yet. He told his friends he was going alone, but Sandy and James, who started to feel that the situation was getting out of hand, decided to go with him. The basement was cold and dark, with metal stairs creaking with every step. The smell was sharp, and the air felt heavy, as if frozen. When they reached the lower floor, suddenly the same sound appeared again. Heavy, slow movement. But this time it wasn't just a sound, it felt like something was there, with them. "This can't just be sounds," Bob said, slowly turning around. "What is it?" Darkness. Instantly everything turned black. A real terror filled the hearts of all of them. Suddenly, they saw a figure in front of them. It was dark, almost imperceptible, but its eyes glowed red, like the reflection of fire in deep darkness. They froze in fear, and none of them could say a word. "We have to go," Sandy whispered, but her voice seemed to lack strength. She began to move backward, but it was already too late. The ghost or creature, whoever it was, began to approach them. "Why are you here?" "Hello," dreadful voice came from the darkness. It was not just a sound. It was the feeling of the presence of something that had long been gone but had not forgotten its home. They all ran upstairs, barely sticking together. Their hearts raced faster, their legs shook, and it was unclear how they managed to get out of the house. Bob was the last one to run out through the door, and when they found themselves outside, the air felt a bit lighter, But the horror didn't leave them. They looked back at the house and saw it standing silently, not reacting to their actions. "We shouldn't go back there," James said, turning to his friends. He looked frightened, but it wasn't just panic. It was the realization that they had seen something that couldn't be explained. They didn't know what had happened to the house and would never find out why it looked abandoned and sinister. However, they all agreed that they never wanted to return to that place. They drove to the city, but from that moment on, their lives were never the same. Fear stayed with them, and nothing could shake that feeling. The friends no longer met as often as before. Although they all tried to return to normal life, that terrifying experience left a deep mark on their souls. They didn't speak about what happened in the house, but each of them carried memories that would never disappear. Bob, who was the most determined of them all, gradually became quieter. He changed jobs and started avoiding any places that reminded him of the events of that night. His eyes no longer shone as they once did, and even in the best moments of his life, he could feel his gaze meet the darkness that never left him. Sandy also changed. She was no longer as open, and her attitude toward the world around her became wary. At night, she was sometimes awoken by a sudden anxiety, and she had to go outside to make sure nothing was following her. She even began seeing a psychologist, trying to cope with a feeling that still haunted her. James couldn't shake the thoughts of what happened in that basement. It seemed like it couldn't have been real, but his mind couldn't peacefully accept it as a mere fantasy. Sometimes he would wake up in the middle of the night, hearing raspy sounds that seemed to come from the darkness. He literally had to fight his fear to fall back asleep. But what changed the most was their attitude toward the houses that were once places of their meetings and rest. They couldn't explain why that area had been so important, but each of them, at least once, looked back, always with the feeling that they had left part of themselves behind there. Several years passed. The night that changed their lives was no longer mentioned. The friends didn't meet, although they remained in touch through social networks. But that house, which had seemed abandoned, still stood there, silent and dark, just as it had been. Over the years, the house gradually decayed. The windows darkened with dust and dirt, and the doors became unwelcoming, as if every entrance was restricted. A few months ago, local residents began noticing that the house looked more and more neglected, and at night, strange sounds came from it from time to time. Everyone was afraid to approach the place, but none dared to investigate what was really going on inside. Only one person decided to take the step, a young man named Tim, who didn't believe in the supernatural and was looking for new adventures. He shared with his friends that he was going to the old house to find out why people were afraid of the place. After several weeks without hearing from him, Tim's family filed a missing persons report. The search party that went to the house never returned. That was the last thing that happened with the place. The house remained empty and shrouded in mist once again. No one dared approach it again. But in every glance from the friends remained the shadow of that night. And they all knew, no matter how forgotten that house seemed, it was and always would be a part of their memories, an invisible burden they carried with them throughout their lives.